This is the next workshop in the 2024 New York State World Languages Professional Learning Series. My name is Candice Black, and I'm your World Language Associate in the Office of Bilingual Education and World Languages of the New York State Education Department. Welcome to Standards in Action, Presentational Communication Strategies by Dr. Lori Langer de Ramirez, Dr. Joanne O'Toole, and Bill Heller. What does presentational communication look like in action? This session provides in-depth and practical suggestions for planning and facilitating presentational communication. Learn about task design to enable learners to engage in real-world tasks for authentic audiences with particular attention paid to the presentational language functions: describe, inform, narrate, explain, and persuade. Come away with new insights into Standard 3 and multiple strategies to guide lesson planning in the presentational mode. Our presenters today are Dr. Lori Langer de Ramirez, Dr. Joanne O'Toole, and Bill Heller. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Lori, Joanne, and Bill to begin this webinar.
Thank you, Candy. And this is Joanne, and I'm going to get us started. And I do want, actually, Bill, could you go back to the last slide for just a moment? So this is Standards in Action Presentational Communication Strategies. And I want to point out that this is the third in a three-part series. You will find the recordings of interpretive and interpersonal presentation, or excuse me, try that again. Interpretive and interpersonal communication strategies on our professional learning webpage. So please make sure, if you didn't attend those live or haven't had a chance to view them yet, that you take a look at those, because the three together will give you a very robust overview of how to confidently implement all of the communication modes and standards. Thank you. So we have two more, actually potentially three more webinars in our spring series. April 24th, plan to join us from 4 to 5 p.m. Linguistic Diversity in the Heritage Classroom, Educational Practices that Celebrate Home Languages with Maria Quintanilla. And I've seen a preview of it. It will be wonderful. Then on May 21st, also from 4 to 5 p.m., Levering Social Justice Approaches to Affirm and Support World Language Students. Also looks to be a wonderful opportunity. We will be presenting a Checkpoint A benchmark assessment guidance webinar for ASL, but that is not yet scheduled. So keep that in mind, to keep your eyes open for when that's being offered, if ASL is a language you teach or one that you are interested in. So always remembering our webinar symbols, keeping your microphone muted, we appreciate that. You'll see the blue thought bubble in today's session reminding you that we're going to prompt you to think about something. This is not to unmute yourself, and it's also not to put anything in the chat. Just think. At the end of today's session, you will see the chat icon where we will invite you to enter information into the chat. In the meantime, we really do ask that you avoid using the chat so that people can stay focused on the content of the webinar. And whenever there is an item in the handouts folder that Bill is linking into the chat, you will see the folder icon in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. We have 4 goals for today's session. Starting, I can identify characteristics of purposeful presentational tasks. I can identify the importance of context and audience in designing presentational tasks. Third, I can identify strategies for designing and managing presentational tasks. And finally, I can identify examples of presentational speaking and writing tasks for checkpoints A, B, and C. So I want to start by inviting you to reflect. And again, there's our thought bubble. This is just think alone. No chat, no unmuting yourself, just thinking. And what I would like for you to think about is what is one presentational task that you have learners do, either in the current academic year or one from the past. So get that in mind. Once you have that presentational task in mind, I want you to think about the answers to these questions. What is the product you ask learners to produce? What must learners do or include in that product? What is its communicative purpose and context? And who is the audience? Just going to pause for a moment so you can think about your answers to that question. Okay, hopefully you have something in mind. I'd like to take a look back at presentational tasks I used to assign. I was a Spanish teacher for 16 years. It's been a few years since I've been in the secondary classroom, but I've taken the time to look back on some of my past practices in light of what I know now. So, the first of the two presentational tasks from my past practice is this one. It is from my Spanish 4 class, and it was my art unit. And you can see a screenshot of the actual handout I gave my learners. And the directions on the handout said, write a letter from King Charles IV to Goya, the famous Spanish painter, expressing your opinion about the royal family portrait. And we can see an image of the royal portrait that Goya had painted of Charles IV and his family. And include 7 different uses of por and para in the letter and highlight the uses and explain them, explain, sorry, typo there, the reasons for using them in the key below. And I had given them spaces for identifying their 7 different uses and explaining them. So my product was a letter. What my learners had to include were 7 uses of a grammatical concept with explanations. The purpose was to express an opinion about a painting, and oh, it was also to show me they knew how to use por and para. And the audience was the Spanish painter Goya, as well as the teacher, me, who was evaluating the grammatical accuracy. Let's take a look at a second presentational task that I had learners do. This was from my Spanish 5 class, and it was a folktale unit. And you may or may not be aware of Juan Bobo folktales. Juan Bobo is a folk character from Puerto Rico. And so my directions to my learners who had already read 3 Juan Bobo stories or Juan Bobo folktales was from the ideas you write below, and I gave them some lines for writing their ideas on, create an original Juan Bobo story that correctly uses the imperfect tense, 25 points, the preterite tense, 25 points, reflects the characters, 10 points, actions, 10 points, and humor, 10 points of Juan Bobo, and that is written well and correctly for 25 points. And yes, I acknowledge it's 105 points. My math wasn't very good. But if we take a closer look, we can see the product was a Puerto Rican Juan Bobo folktale, or one that reflected a Puerto Rican Juan Bobo folktale. And what were they to include? The imperfect and preterite tenses and qualities of this particular genre of literature. The purpose was to narrate, and the context was the Puerto Rican context. But I guess I would probably add the purpose was also to show They knew how to use the preterite and imperfect. And the audience, a reader who may or may not be familiar with this genre of folktale, and the teacher, me, who was evaluating their ability to use accurately the preterite and the imperfect tenses. So I want to bring us to present day. And one of the wonderful things we have in the present day is our high leverage teaching practices. High leverage teaching practices being those research based practices to use in our teaching. And high leverage practice number 9 is engaging learners in purposeful written communication, specifically written presentational communication. I'm going to acknowledge presentational communication can also be spoken. That wasn't the focus of this particular high leverage teaching practice. But I want to share with you a few excerpts from this high leverage teaching practice. The authors, Glisson and Donato, write, when instruction about writing is provided, it often amounts to little more than brainstorming vocabulary and directing learners to use a particular grammatical form, and in some cases specifying the number of times the form needs to appear in the piece of writing. And they go on and say this practice may result in learners thinking that the purpose of writing in a foreign language class is only to display accurate grammatical forms and sentence structures. Really caused me to think. So let's take a close look at the wording of Standard 3 presentational communication, Standard 2 for classical languages, and then we're going to come back to my examples. So the words of presentational communication standard are that the learners present information and ideas on a variety of topics. That wording represents the context of communication. It goes on to say that it's adapted to various audiences of listeners, readers, or viewers. Now, what's a little bit tricky about this is that the audiences are listening. So that means our learners are speaking, or our audiences are reading, meaning that our students, our learners are writing, or our audiences are viewing, which could mean two things. It could mean that our learners are signing, or it could mean that our learners have created a product that is audiovisual. Those, the reading, the writing, the signing, the creation of audiovisual, and the speaking all represent the language skills associated with presentational communication. I want to take a closer look, though, at the word audiences, because the audience is who the presentational communication is intended to be delivered to. And it asks the learners to have their audience in mind. And if that audience represents a culture unlike their own, that's where the cultural information is embedded in the standard. And the final portion of presentational communication are these words: describe, inform, narrate, explain, or persuade. And those 5 verbs are our 5 language functions of presentational communication. And remember, language functions are the purposes for which we're having our learners carry out this standard. So I would like to say that the ultimate purpose of presentational communication is for students to first organize their thoughts, and they may do so in one of many ways. Bill, can you click? This may be where they're doing their research. They may be using a graphic organizer or taking notes. But this is the place because presentational communication allows for rehearsal and editing. So they're gathering and organizing their thoughts. And then they deliver their message to a particular audience using the genre that best delivers the message in the classroom and beyond. And so they may be delivering it to their classmates. They may be delivering it through the internet to a much wider audience. They may be delivering it with members of the target culture who may be in person or who may be virtual. But ultimately, presentational communication is about delivering a message to an audience. And I've used the word genre here, and I just want to make sure that we have a shared definition. A genre is a particular style of audio, print, or visual text that's used to carry out a given language function, and it's defined by a set of characteristics. So we're going to take a look at some various types of genres that correspond with the different language functions of the presentational standard. These are just some examples, and note that some of these may be um, more typically used in writing, some may more typically be used in speaking, some more for audiovisual and signing. So, genres that help our learners describe labels, a poem, a tribute, a witness report. Inform, a brochure, an invitation, a letter, a report. Explain, an excuse, instructions, a myth. Narrate, an anecdote, a folk tale, a postcard, a skit, a story. Persuade, an advertisement, an advice column, an argument, a public service announcement. So let's take a moment just to revisit my past practices. Here was my letter from King Charles IV to Goya. And oh, those 7 uses of por and para, along with expressing an opinion. So now that I've had the chance to rethink my past practice, this is what it might look like. And Bill, you can click. My new directions say, write a letter from King Charles IV to Goya expressing your opinion about the royal family portrait and use evidence from the painting to support your opinion. So there's no more required numbers of uses of por and para. They'll use por and para as they naturally occur in their communication, along with any other language structure that would help them express an opinion. But what they will do differently is use evidence from the painting to express that opinion. So we can now see I'm using the same genre, it's a letter, but what I'm including is evidence from the painting to support that opinion for the express purpose of expressing and providing evidence for an opinion of the painting, which is the context. And there is one audience, and it is the painter Goya. My Juan Bobo story, which had all of those uses of the preter and the imperfect and expectation of accuracy. When I rethought it, I rewrote the directions from the ideas you write below, and I would still give them a place to put their ideas together. That's part of that organizing your thoughts. Create an original Juan Bobo story that reflects the characters, actions, and humor of Juan Bobo. And again, it's not that we would ignore the grammar, but they would choose the grammar that supported their ability to write the story that reflects the characters, actions, and humor. And so we have the same genre, a folk tale that reflects the Puerto Rican Juan Bobo folk tale. Qualities of the particular genre of folk tale would be what they would need to include, and their purpose would be to narrate, and the context, the rural Puerto Rican context. And the audience will still be the reader who may or may not be familiar with the genre, but not necessarily me as the teacher who's focusing on the grammatical accuracy. It's the message to the audience. So I would invite you, now that we've taken a closer look, to take a moment to think back to that presentational task you had in mind. What modifications might you make to the task to more fully reflect the purpose of presentational communication relative to genre, communicative purpose and context, audience? Take just a moment. And now I will turn you over to my colleague, Lori.
Thank you, Joanne. Well, I'm certainly thinking about some presentational tasks that I've designed in the past. That was helpful. Thank you. And now we're going to dovetail off of what Joanne was referencing, and we're going to talk about that importance of context and audience. So I don't know about your kids. Sometimes my kids look like this, not all the time, but sometimes. And oftentimes they're asking themselves questions. And they might say these out loud as well. So why are we doing this? Who is this for? And then the ubiquitous, will this be on the test? And these are reasonable questions that our kids are asking. They're really looking for meaning and in the work that they're doing in the language classroom. And so we can answer a few of these by talking about context. So again, the question, why are we doing this? Context will provide some background, some frame for the work that they will be doing and for their presentational task. So our definition here for context is the circumstances that form the setting for an event, statement, or idea, and in terms of which it can be fully understood and assessed. So context is what is going to give them some understanding of that question, why are we doing this? The audience is the answer to the question, who is this for? And Joanne referenced the importance of audience and thinking about who is going to be listening to or viewing or reading this presentational message. So for our definition for audience, we have the people giving or likely to give attention to something. So when we think about audience, it's also important to think about a fictional audience. Perhaps it's an audience that might have been made up or one that that we are constructing for the purpose of a task. It could also be a real audience, a real person, or possibly a real creature. We'll talk about that in a moment. So let's look at context for a second. Again, these are circumstances that form the setting, and it really provides students with information so that they can understand the meaning of what they're about to produce. Two areas that I think respond well, or two task designs that respond well to this question about context are simulation and role play. We'll start with simulation. So a simulation is having students act out real life or real world situations, but they're playing themselves. So again, the context may be constructed, but they are responding to prompts and they are producing language in their own voice. They are themselves, albeit in a fictitious context. And the example we have here is from the Day of the Dead. And this is an ofrenda that students have created. So the context is celebration of the holiday in our school. And they are themselves. They are bringing their own information, their own background to the task. In this case, a student chose to celebrate a pet who had passed away, and that was her playing her own self in this particular simulation. In contrast, a role play involves students acting out a particular role in accordance with the perceived expectations with regard to a character's behavior in a particular context. So again, this may be a fictitious context that is designed for the purpose of communication, And in this case, the student will be playing a role, given information that they either research or that is provided in class or through another means. In this case, the example I'm sharing with you is connected to a thematic unit in which students are researching the opinions of living artists. And so they were given a selection of artists. They reached out to artists in emails, which were also presentational tasks. And they asked the artists certain questions. And for a debate that followed, they took on the persona of that artist, using the artist's actual opinions on the topic to be debated. So in this case, the role play involves students not playing themselves, playing a role in a context that is constructed and quite robust. So those are two task designs to think about. Now let's look at audience. Again, these are the people or creatures giving or likely to give attention to something. The first example we have on the lower left is again from our Day of the Dead unit, where students are reviewing each other's ofrendas. In this case, they're playing the role of neighbors and classmates, being themselves. They are viewing some text on the ofrendas, and they are also listening to stories about loved ones. So again, in this case, the presentational task involves writing and involves speaking. Another presentational task, and these are all for novice learners, involves students writing a message to each other. And this is the example on the far right, where they are writing on a literal wall messages for students in other classes. And so this is an authentic audience in an authentic context. Classmates are then reading these personal messages on the walls. And then finally, we have a presentational writing task where the audience is an axolotl. And if you ask my students, that axolotl very much read those messages. So in this case, an injured axolotl is reading get well messages from students. And you can see their get well messages there in Post-its. And so here is a presentational writing task with the audience being an animal. Why not? So again, these are some novice ideas. Let's have a look at some perhaps intermediate tasks for students. Again, the audience are the people likely to give attention to the presentational message. On the far left, we have an example of a political party thematic unit where students were designing their own political parties. And so students were playing the role of citizens who were reading and also listening to political manifestos. Again, the student creating the message, or students in this case, are writing and speaking. Another example is this letter that students have written together, and this is a presentational writing task, where the audience is the Spanish government. And the Spanish government is reading this letter that students have written. It is a letter of protest and solidarity. Again, the audience being the Spanish government, a presentational writing task. And finally, these students are involved in a protest. And so the audience is workers who are reading posters and listening to labor speeches, the presentational task being writing those posters and of course, speaking and really proclaiming these labor speeches. So these are some examples of audience to keep in mind that you might design for your own tasks. So let's talk about designing these presentational tasks. There are many ways to jump into the task of designing presentational tasks. Of course, we want to start with thinking about what it is we can expect of our students at different proficiency levels. So here we have the presentational performance indicators for novice, mid, high students. They can create practiced and memorized expressions, simple sentences, and familiar and everyday topics. For our intermediate low-mid students, we can ask them to create simple sentences, some series of sentences. And again, we're really looking at a variety of familiar topics. For our intermediate, mid-high students, we might expect them to create a series of sentences and connected sentences. They might have better control of time frame. And of course, they can focus on some more concrete and additionally researched topics. So with that in mind, we can start constructing some tasks for our students in line with what it is that we can expect them to produce, given their proficiency level. And here are some that I came up with for our different presentational language functions. So for checkpoint A, let's look across at describe. Students might describe school supplies they need in a list, the audience being their parents. For checkpoint B, they might describe a family celebration, including the activities and food in a social media post. Checkpoint C students might describe their ideal summer job orally to a school counselor. For the language function of informing, checkpoint A students might inform a classmate about a party that they will be having in an invitation. Checkpoint B students might inform a key pal about their school schedule in an email message. And students with some higher proficiency might inform their teacher about the reasons for not doing their homework in a speech. For narration, students can narrate the activities they normally do over the weekend in a journal entry. They might narrate the steps to help someone to get from one place to another in a set of directions. Or they might narrate the origin of something in the world in an original ideological tale. Looking at the language function of explain, students in checkpoint A might explain the stickers they chose to decorate their laptop orally to a classmate. Checkpoint B students might explain how to do a simple task with all of the steps included in a YouTube tutorial. And for checkpoint C, they might explain what gift they would want to help save the earth in a blurb on a door. And that is a reference to the film Encanto. And then for checkpoint A under persuade, we have persuade a friend to choose one destination over another for the school trip in a text message. Checkpoint B students might persuade the school community to save an endangered animal in a poster. Checkpoint C students might persuade classmates about the pros and cons of having animals in zoos in a debate. And you see all of the genre here bolded. But these were things I started to come up with, and it took me a little bit of time, to be honest, friends. And sometimes we run out of creativity. And so I thought to myself, what might ChatGPT offer us or other AI solutions? Can AI help with constructing this sort of task? Let's find out. I asked ChatGPT, can you make me a list of presentational speaking and writing tasks that include an authentic real-world audience and context? And ChatGPT, always amenable, responded certainly and came up with the following ideas. And you'll see there's quite a lot here. They came up with all sorts of ideas, some good, some not as good. And so what I would encourage you to do is really look at the results that you get. So for example, one result was to create a research symposium presentation. I don't know about your K through 12 students, but a few of mine are involved in research symposia. And so I thought that I wouldn't really do anything with that suggestion. And so you might jettison that one. But I really liked create a social media campaign. And that is something that I think our students could not only relate to, but is something that they may have done already in their home language. So these were examples that were quite a bit more advanced than I had hoped for as well. And so I went back to ChatGPT and asked a follow-up question. And I don't know why I'm compelled to be polite with ChatGPT, but I was. And I asked, please only include novice level tasks. And once again, ChatGPT was very amenable and supportive and said, certainly, here's a list of novice level tasks. And again, some of these are wonderful and some less so. So let's have a look at some of the ones that AI helped us find. Again, some I didn't think were really useful or something that our students could relate to. For instance, a book club meeting. I don't know, my kids aren't involved in book clubs too much. And then a lot of them were classroom based, and that's fine. There are contexts in which the classroom is your audience, but I wanted something that was a little bit more creative. And so the class project and the language class, not so much. But I really liked the idea of exchanging letters with a pen pal from another school that was real and authentic, or distributing invitations within the school or community. I love the idea of actually physically making something and sharing it with an audience. So that's some tips from AI. There are some good resources that can help you to design some of these tasks. And now I'm going to hand it over to my good friend Bill, who's going to talk about managing presentational tasks.
Oops. Thank you, Lori. So Joanne talked about how she's changed her thinking about presentational tasks. I'd like to talk about a similar shift in my own practice concerning projects. I used to present all the content of a unit, the vocab, the grammar up front, and then I'd try and come up with some big project and trying to integrate all the stuff that we'd learned. And as I began to understand the modes of communication and the relationship between input, interaction, and output, I began to move from big all-encompassing projects to a variety of performance tasks. And here are the key differences between projects versus performance tasks. So a project is usually content focused, a culture topic, or focused on a vocabulary and grammar structure, similar to how Joanne used to structure her presentational tasks, focusing on the grammar. The performance task, however, is always language function focused. So it targets one or more of the language functions. A project is usually skill focused. It may resemble a presentational task, but the focus is on the skill, the writing, not necessarily the message. Whereas a standards-based, again, is one of the modes: interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational. As we've seen in our other previous webinars, these are much larger concepts. And again, the focus is on the message and the communication process. And specifically with presentational, the relationship between communicating to an audience. It is often product focused, and sometimes that product is not connected to the language function we're trying to practice. We end up spending tons of time producing a product that has little to do with language itself or communication. The performance tasks are always communication focused. Projects are oftentimes evaluated with checklists, and they're quantitative. We're counting usages of certain structures and so forth. We grade on things like following directions or creativity and other types of things, whereas performance tests are evaluated using proficiency or oriented rubrics. Projects that I assigned were nearly always summative. They were the end of the unit, and there's big value on that grade. Whereas performance tests can be big or small, summative or formative. And finally, projects were often time consuming, and a lot of the time didn't have to do with producing language. It had to do with either researching or building, constructing things, playing with technology, learning Canva or whatever. And then performance tasks, they can be less time consuming and involve more rich target language use. So how do we manage presentational tasks? As with the interpretive and interpersonal communication focused lessons, we can employ a sequence of strategies to guide our students in carrying out presentational tasks. We group these tasks as pre, during, and post-task strategies. So let's take a look at this sample presentational writing task. So our can-do statement, it was, I can give advice, which is a function related to persuasion, about dealing with relationship problems, that's our context, by writing an entry for an advice column for a class blog, and that's our acceptable evidence. So for this one, we're going to write a short note about a problem, requesting advice, and then give advice for solving the problem as the advice columnist, Querida Carlota, or Dear Carlota. In our genre, in this case, is an advice column. The communication will include advice and reasons. The purpose and context is the language function of giving advice, and the context is relationship problems. And then our audience will be their classmates in a blog, readers of Querida Carlota's advice column. So our pre strategies equip learners to be successful in their tasks. Let's take a look. First of all, we select a task that corresponds to the targeted language function. So if we're emphasizing one language function in our unit, we want to select a task that corresponds to that language function. We want that alignment between kind of what we're practicing and assessing with what we say we want to do, accomplish in the unit. We can equip learners to enact the specific language function that we're targeting. Then we can model successful task completion, provide scaffolds and supports, and then finally define the task and then establish our expectations. So we do all these things up front to help our learners be successful. So first things is to make sure we're selecting a task that corresponds with the language function that's targeted in our unit. So we want to make sure that we're picking a genre that lends itself to enacting that language function. And also make sure that it's within the wheelhouse of our students, that it's within those performance indicators for our proficiency target for the checkpoint learners we're dealing with. Now, in this case, my target language function is persuade, and the genre I've selected is an advice column. Then we equip learners to enact the specific language function. And first we want to equip them with the words they're going to need, the words and the concepts. And to do that, we provide rich, authentic input using authentic resources to develop thematic vocabulary needed to carry out the task by completing a variety of interpretive tasks. And so in this case, I'm looking at an infographic that gives students the language for talking about problems and solutions and, looking at results. And so this infographic is one interpretive activity among several I can do to start building up that bank of vocabulary to talk about problems, solutions, and again, relationship problems, specifically as the context of this task. Then also to develop the language function, we want to give them the grammar structures that they're going to need. So we're going to use a variety of grammar and context strategies to identify the structures needed to carry out the language function required by the task. In this case, our language function is giving advice. So I've targeted the grammatical structure of familiar commands. And so I'm going to include some grammar and context strategies for developing the students' awareness and use of familiar commands. So one thing I could do is do a PACE model lesson relating to this authentic meme on different commands related to how to live together, basic rules for getting along together. And all of these are familiar commands, some do's and a few don'ts. We can also use structured input activities by Lee and Van Patten for focusing in, helping the learners focus in and practice using these structures. In this case, by looking at a bunch of commands, familiar commands, and deciding whether it's good advice or bad advice. Now, if you're interested in structured input or PACE model, how to do those strategies, how to implement those strategies for using grammar and context. We have the webinar on the role of grammar. It's a two-part webinar that will be linked in the PDF document that will be put in the handouts folder following the presentation. Next, we can model successful completion One way to do that with presentational tasks is by examining work samples, often called anchor papers, together with the students. So we can use anchor papers or recordings or demonstrations to model the task, what the task should look like. Now, sometimes you need to create these on your own. As the teacher, you create a model of what you want it to look like. Other times, if you've done this task before and you have student samples that you've saved, you can use samples that you've saved from previous usages of this task to show the students, to give them an idea of what good performance looks like. Then this is the time where you also start to let them know the expectations by giving them the rubric that you're going to use. And so you distribute and apply the assessment rubric to the anchor papers or sample tasks. So you show them how the anchor papers address each of the elements or the dimensions of the rubric. And again, the master rubrics are in the handouts folder as well. Then we provide scaffolds so that they have an idea of the tools that they need to support them in assembling to put their tasks together. So in presentational tasks, graphic organizers can provide a helpful scaffold. If we're speaking tasks, maybe note cards or drawings, so that they can brainstorm ideas and then start to organize their information. Now, I think it's always good to, for me in my own practice, I've discovered that because this is important, this is not something necessarily to relegate for a home assignment, but something to actually take the time in class to do while you're there, and you can help and support them to do that. In this case, for our advice letters, we're going to do two graphic organizers, one where they brainstorm problems to write their problem letter about, and then once they pick their problem, generate ideas for advice for solutions to that problem. So we're going to use two different graphic organizers, probably on two different days. Now we define the task and establish our expectations. And this is really, really important, especially in this day and age. We're identifying and give specific examples of acceptable uses of composition tools, including dictionaries, online resources, and translators. And you're going to make these decisions as the professional that you are based on your students, your experience with your students, your own vision for using these tools, and your school policies that you have about these tools or departmental policies. So you're going to lay out for the students what they can use, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what's are ethical uses of dictionaries and translators, and what are non-ethical forms of using these tools. And then you make those expectations clear. Finally, restate what the task is with all the expectations that you've defined. Then you set them loose to start working on the task. So during the task, you facilitate opportunities for initial drafting or composition, support learners in carrying out the communication task, and facilitate peer and teacher feedback. Again, this can be through various rehearsals and iterations and revisions of the drafting that took place in that first step. So facilitate opportunities for initial drafting and support learners in carrying out the task. We can allow time for crafting the initial written draft or outline. Again, give time in class for this because it's important. It's something that you want them to devote time, and it's something that you want to be able to monitor. Provide assistance and guide students in using scaffolds, supports, and including graphic organizers. Those graphic organizers they created, how do they turn that into prose, into what they're composing, in this case, a letter? And you can, if you want to, provide a checklist of essential elements to check for. Are you using the commands, that to give the advice? Are you using the characteristics of the genre of advice letters? You can give some suggestions about length. Have they given the reasons? Give a checklist. You may or may not choose to do that. Then facilitate peer and teacher feedback. Give them multiple opportunities to share drafts with one or more classmates. If it's a speaking thing, they can walk around and share what they're going to say with different partners and get different feedback. It's oftentimes helpful if you're asking peers to give feedback, to give them something specific to look for, using guide questions like, do you understand the message? Is the message interesting or entertaining? How could I zip it up a little bit? Are supporting materials attractive and clearly presented? So you can give the peer something to specifically look for to give feedback on. And then provide time for revision, representation to a different peer or a different group of peers. Finally, we have in our post strategies some things you can do. Provide an opportunity for the learner self-assessment. Create a forum for sharing the work with an audience. And assess the task performance. First of all, you're going to want to restate the purpose of the task and check to see if the task is completed using the identified language function. So in other words, you could have the students sit down, look at their work. Have you done this task? Do you have these things? They can maybe even circle places on the work itself where they've done those things. Invite the students to self-assess. And again, I find this very powerful that they have an opportunity to self-assess, either using the checklist that you give them the rubric and allow them to self-score based on the rubric, and give some reflection on maybe what was difficult, what they enjoyed about doing the project, and so forth. Give them an opportunity to reflect on their own learning. Then finally, create a forum for sharing work with an audience. This allows them to show off their work. And it also, if they know they're going to share their work with an audience, they probably are going to put a little more effort into that self-assessment, into that revision process, because they know that someone besides the teacher is going to look at it. So you can use online formats like Flip or Padlet. You could use a gallery walk or poster session format, or you could create a fair or assembly like a poetry slam for them to present their work. In the case of our advice letters, I chose to have them put them on Padlet, where they put the letter with the problem, then the solution, and then classmates could read each other's problems and solutions and say whether they were good advice or bad advice, or make some comments using the Padlet comment function. So that would be for this particular task. And finally, you're going to assess the product and give the students some feedback. Again, you'll use the rubric you gave them way back in the pre-task stage. And you're going to use that rubric, including comments, to help them make improvements or to help them level up if they've already got a handle on what you've asked them to do, to show the student what their next steps are, how they can level up in future performances. And then consider giving brief individual conferences when giving summative feedback as you are able to do so maybe while everyone else is working on something else. You can call them aside and go over the rubric feedback with them. Now with some other examples of how to implement these steps, the pre, during, and post, we turn it back to Lori.
Thank you, Bill. So let's talk about some examples of presentational speaking and writing tasks. But I want to start by encouraging you to think for a moment. I know Joanne encouraged you to think. When you think of presentational speaking tasks that you've designed for your classrooms, do they tend to look like this? A student at the front of the room? I know they did for me for many years. That's what I thought about when I thought about presentational speaking. Or presentational writing, you might think immediately of an essay or something long form. So I want to encourage you to think about presentational tasks occurring every day in your classes in very small chunks in lots of different ways. One of my favorite ways to work on presentational speaking and writing is through do nows. So every day I have a do now task on the board. I use these wonderful notebooks. They are very small, very thin. Kids have them, they decorate them. These are formative. They happen daily, they are scaffolded, and they are super fun for kids. Let me show you what this looks like. So a presentational speaking and writing prompt always begins in my class with a photograph. And I have a large collection of these photographs that just are everywhere on the internet. And I collect them and use them all the time. And oftentimes I ask students to choose the image that they want on a particular day, or the image might connect to a cultural theme or a particular topic that we're covering. So here's an example of one that my students have used. Here's a whole bunch of them. You'll notice there's a lot of animals. That is a theme. And so these are different things that might prompt student response. So what might a prompt look like? Let's have a look with these 4 examples. So we see my poor frightened dog. The prompt for a presentational writing task might be, describe what is happening in these photos. You could use describe for all of these, but let's dig a little deeper and see what other prompts we might use. I might ask students to do a presentational speaking task at their seats in which they persuade this dog to make friends with the kittens. That's their task for the day, and it will be a very quick task, and they just need to say something quick to meet that language function. For my resting cat here, I might ask them to inform this surly cat that he is loitering and he must move along. So something very, very quick, very fast. And again, the prompts can be changed depending on the proficiency level of your students. For the very upset citrus fruits, I might ask them to narrate a story, and this is a presentational writing task. Narrate a story about why these citrus fruits are so unhappy. And again, these are very, very short bits of text that they would do at the start of class. And then finally, we have our friend Salvador Dali, which you may or may not reference for students. And I asked them to explain why this man is walking an anteater. And you can imagine your kids have lots of interesting ideas about that. So again, this is a daily task. It happens in very small bursts at the beginning of class. They write in these notebooks. We do it analog and not online, and it's something that they enjoy. I can show you a little bit more, Bill, if you flip to the next slide, what this looks like. So again, students might, in this picture, narrate a story about this stingray who loves to photobomb tourists. I said earlier, these are scaffolded tasks. And by that, I mean students are able to ask for words that they want. I give them 3 new words. If they ask for a word and their classmates are able to give it to them first, that's a freebie. I write it on the board. They keep running lists. These also add to personal vocabulary lists, words that they themselves find important and necessary. And so these were the 3 words that came out of this image that day. And then students will write a quick blurb about this particular image. So that's one way to incorporate presentational tasks into your daily lessons. Let's have a look at a checkpoint A example using Bill's excellent pre, during, and post strategies. So this language function is describe, and this pre-strategy involves equipping learners to enact a specific language function. And here I'm providing them with an authentic resource. This is an infographic with some school supplies, and I want students to interpret this infographic, and this will set them up for success in the presentational task to follow. The during strategy involves facilitating opportunities for initial drafting. Again, this is for checkpoint A, and so students are really writing lists. The task I'm asking them to complete, or the can-do statement, states, I can describe the school supplies I need for September in a list for parents using vivid describing words. And that text you see in red, that agree in gender and number, that's really for me, the teacher. That wouldn't be student facing, but just to remind myself that I'm really focusing on agreement, in this case in gender and number, in this task. And then for a post writing task, students would create a forum, or we would create a forum for sharing work with an audience. And in this case, I wanted students to share each other's work. And so the can-do statement reads, I can describe the school supplies. Again, they're going to describe not just their own school supplies, but we're going to determine which school supplies tended to turn up on everybody's list. Let's have a look at a checkpoint B example, in this case with narration. And this is a presentational speaking task. And so we'll start with the strategy of modeling successful task completion. Here I will have students listening to or viewing and listening to an authentic video of somebody narrating some steps to get from one place to another in Mexico City in the subway. They will also have an actual subway map to look on, and so that is giving them, that is modeling the task that we're about to ask them to complete. For the during part of the task, we will facilitate peer and teacher feedback by having students share drafts with each other. And so in this case, the task is to narrate the steps a classmate must take to go from one room in the school to another in an audio recording. And so they have the school map and they are going to hide something in a room and narrate the steps to get from one place to the next. And of course, they're going to draft that and share that with classmates to make sure that they have set themselves up for success in the task. And the post task will involve the students narrating this particular map with directions, and you can see some examples of the directions. They might start in the 8th grade classroom, make a left at the next hallway, make a right, go straight. At the next hallway, make a left, go straight, and they will achieve some prize should they get to the place that they are intended to go. And so we're going to check that the task is completed because some students are going to be listening to this. So again, here's an authentic audience. These are students who are listening to what the other students have recorded for them to go find this treasure. And there's also ways to extend these tasks and to incorporate a cultural theme. This is an example of a similar task where students are directing other students to go from one place to another on a map. In this case, they're taking a boat around the Lake Xochimilco in Mexico, and they're traveling through the Chinampas, or these canals, and their goal is to get from one place to the next without bothering an axolotl. Of course, this is a unit on the axolotl, and this is a great way to extend that task and to bring in a cultural theme as well. And then finally, we have a checkpoint C example. The pre-strategy involves selecting a task that corresponds with the targeted language function. And in this case, the targeted language function is going to be explain. And so they'll start by reading this wonderful picture book with tons of excuses for why somebody didn't do their homework, which can be really relevant to some of our students. So they're going to analyze this picture book with excuses. The during task involves students really using supports to carry out this particular communicative task. In this case, they're going to have a checklist with some of the essential elements that we want them to achieve. It may be grammar structures, it could be genre characteristics, length and discourse type. And the can-do statement reads, I can persuade my teacher that I didn't do my homework for a very good reason in a short oral speech. And so the checklist is going to help them to figure out if they've completed the task successfully or not. In this case, the first excuse, my teeth itch, not so great. Not only is it a very silly excuse, but it's very short and it doesn't meet the requirements of this particular task. The second example that the student created, it slipped out of my hands and blew away. That's also why I'm late to school. I was chasing it. Very plausible. And also the right length and contains some of the genre characteristics that we've required. And so allowing them to create this task in advance and check if they've completed it correctly. And then the post would be to assess the task performance. And here is our single point rubric that again is in your folders. And this is enabling students to not only understand if they've completed the task to the level that is set for them in this case, checkpoint C, but what are some ways that they can level up? What are some ways that they can make it even better? So those are some examples. Let's come back to our can-do statements for this webinar and see if we can say yes to all of them, and I hope we can. The first can-do statement reads, I can identify characteristics of purposeful presentational tasks. I can identify the importance of context and audience in designing presentational tasks. I can identify strategies for designing and managing presentational tasks. And finally, I can identify examples of presentational speaking and writing tasks for checkpoints A, B, and C.